Hi everyone, we are here on Chapter 8, Communication, which is something that's really important. Obviously, if you can't communicate, you can't really get stuff done. Whoops, sorry about that. Um, anyway, so we're going to talk about communication. We're going to talk about verbal communication and nonverbal communication. We're going to talk about the communications model and all sorts of things. So the slides are posted online, so follow along with them. Okay, communication, evoking of a shared or common meaning in another person. So sometimes when we talk about communication, and you know this from your own personal experiences, that sometimes there's people who you just understand better than others, or you know that you because you have this maybe because you have a shared experience or a shared background. And if there is no, even if you don't have that common background or shared experience, you still can understand things. Now, if there is no understanding, and if a common meaning, then that means that there's been a communication failure, and communication failures can be really detrimental in any situation. Okay, so there's a couple of key terms we want to talk about: the interpersonal communications, communication between two or more people in an organization. The communicator is the person sending the message, and the receiver is the person accepting the message. Okay, some more terms. A perceptual screen. Remember we talked about perceptions before, and we talked about there was first impression error, stereotyping. I'm testing my own memory right now. First impression error, projection, and there is a fifth one that is escaping me right now. We talked about perception in the beginning of this semester. Okay, so that's the screen is the window through which we see people. So again, imagine like a scrim in front of you, and that things are sort of filtered out, and it impacts the clarity of the communication. There's the message itself that the sender, the communicator, is sending. Feedback is what someone, when you say something back to someone, or make a face or something like that. Then language is actually the actual words that people use, the pronunciation and the words that they use. With the perceptual screen too, the other things that influence it are your age, your gender, your values and your beliefs, your culture, individual needs, that kind of thing. Okay, so let's talk about some other terms too. Data, information, and richness. Data is uninterpreted and unanalyzed facts, like weather temperature, the temperature of the weather for a certain period of time, ball scores, income, sales levels, profit rates, income, absentee rates, that kind of thing. Information is when you take the data and you interpret it and you analyze it and you give it some meaning. So, for example, if there's a high percentage of tardiness one day, that would be the data. The number of people tardy would be the data, and the information on that would be maybe there was a snowstorm or there was a large traffic accident and the highways were backed up. Anyway, and then richness is the ability of a medium to convey meaning to a receiver. So, for example, and we're going to have a chart. There's a chart in the book that talks about it, and we're also going to have a chart coming up in a couple of slides that illustrates the same chart coming up to illustrate it. But there are certain things. If there's a lot of data or a lot of information to be shared, then sometimes it's better to have things written. For example, like a financial report is better to be done written than verbal. So that'll make sense in a couple of minutes, though. Okay, so let's look at the basic communication model here. Again, the communicator and the receiver, we saw those before, the message. And then both the communicator and the receiver have perceptual screens. And then the receiver gives the feedback back to the communicator. So, and then you can flip around. You can be the receiver and the, you can change roles in one conversation from receiver to communicator, communicator to receiver. Okay, again, the perceptual screen, values, beliefs, past experiences, cultural influences, individual needs, age, gender, and then perception that we talked about before, the stereotyping and projection and all those kinds of things from previously in the semester. Okay, so this is the chart I was talking about. Let's see if we can enlarge it a little bit here. So face-to-face discussion has the highest amount of information but low data capacity. And then it kind of goes down. Formal numeric report has lowest information richness in terms of, when we talk about richness, essentially the personal feel that you get, but yet it has the highest data capacity. Okay, let's see here. So you want to think about that. Are you sending things in the proper? Are you sending things in the proper method? So, for instance, with instructions for something, it might be better to give instructions written than verbally. Okay, reflective listening is very important. It's a skill that we can all use in our everyday lives and also in the workplace. Listening carefully to a message and immediately repeating it back to the speaker, so making sure you understand what the person has said. So if someone says, I need this report done by 5 p.m., you might say, you need this report done, we're saying 5 p.m. today, and you need it done because it's due tonight, or because it has to be emailed out by 8, or because you need time to review it before the meeting in the morning, that kind of thing. Do you need it, making sure that you understand exactly what people are talking about. So it helps to clarify things. Okay, so reflective listening helps communicators clarify intended message and correct any misunderstandings. And it's incumbent upon the receiver to participate in the reflective listening, because if the communicator doesn't know that the receiver has questions or needs to clarify, then they don't know to clarify. They're not asked. If the communicator isn't asked, they can't clarify back. And it's very useful in problem solving. Okay, so what does reflective listening emphasize? It's the personal elements. So so that there's some sort of personalization of it. So it's not just very cold and distant. That you understand how the communicator is feeling at the time, and also hopefully will give you some kind of rational and considerate response. Okay, let's talk about some verbal reflective listening tools, if you will. Affirming contact, it means that that if you're actually paying attention and you're with them, that you clarify things that are implicit. Things that are implicit are things that are unsaid. So you might assumptions we make. You might say to someone, drive carefully because the weather is bad, or something like that. So you want to make sure that you clarify things that are quote unquote implicit. Paraphrase is saying something back in your own terms. Again, a way to clarify what's going on. And then also this idea of reflecting the core meanings. Why is it that you're saying this to me, or how is this making you feel? You seem happy about this. You seem angry about this. You seem anxious about this. You might be want to be careful about who you say those things to, but it helps to clarify. The emotion behind a meaning the emotion behind a message is very important to the meaning of the message. Okay, so there's also nonverbal reflective listening skills. Silence. So silence isn't always necessarily a bad thing in a conversation, because sometimes silence means that you're thinking about something, or you're trying to figure something out. And it gives you time to process, and that can give you, depending upon your body language, it can actually say that you're listening. And then eye contact is important. Eye contact is a tricky thing, though. You don't want to have too much eye contact, but you want to make sure you have enough so that they know that you're engaged in the conversation. Okay, one way versus two-way conversation. One way is giving, just writing out directions or writing out information. Two-way communication is when there's some sort of interaction. That's really pretty much it. One-way communication can be good. It's good for facts. It's good for things that are stated that don't necessarily need a response right away. Two-way is when you have to have some kind of give and take between two people, the two people in the conversation. Okay, so 5 keys to effective supervisory communication: expressiveness, empathy, insensitivity, persuasion, and informative. So It should be expressive. There should be some emotion involved so that they know that you are somehow emotionally involved in what's going on. Empathy and sensitivity. It's important to understand, put yourself in a position where you understand what you're trying to understand, the impact the message that you're relaying is having on the other person, and being sensitive to that. It kind of goes back to what we talked about earlier in the semester, again, about emotional intelligence. Persuasion is also an important supervisory skill because of the fact that that is really the point of the manager, is to try to persuade people to participate in activities that will help achieve the goals of the organization. And then finally, informative. There are many things that, as a supervisor, that you need to share with people, and make sure that they have the correct information. A manager or supervisor serves as a conduit of information from upper management to workers. Okay. Communication barriers. There are 5 of them. We're going to talk about them both on this slide and the next slide, both. So physical separation is a problem, and that's something that comes up more and more today in the workplace because there's so many people that are on virtual teams, and also people who are working from a remote location or at different offices, if you will, of the organization. So, someone in the Chicago office talking to someone in the New York office, or someone in the Buffalo office talking to someone in Long Island. So physical separation can be a problem because you don't get that body language and all that kind of thing. Status differences, that sometimes people will feel status differences within the organization. So people feel that they might feel uncomfortable talking to someone who's higher up in the organization. Gender differences, there's no doubt about the fact that men and women communicate differently. There's a tremendous amount of research written about that, and how men and women communicate in the workplace and out of the workplace, and how men and women perceive things, which I know might sound like men and women are equal. I'm not saying that men and women are not equal. I'm just saying that men and women communicate in different ways. So it's important to be aware of that. Cultural diversity. People, it doesn't even necessarily have to be national culture, but people in New England communicate differently than people who are from the South, or people from the Midwest may have different communication styles than people, say, in New York City. So it's important to understand that as well, along with cultural diversity in terms of not just regional culture, but national culture and culture subcultures within the larger culture. And then language, plain old language. We're going to talk about that a little bit more. So those are the barriers: physical separation, status differences, gender differences, cultural diversity, and language. But there are ways around them, of course. Openings that break down barriers. Essentially, with gender differences, just try to make yourself aware of it. If it is an area you're interested in, there is all sorts of literature written about it. One woman who is particularly prolific in her research about it, her name is Deborah Tannen. Perhaps her most famous book is Men and Women Talking from 9 to 5, and it explains things. But women say we more, men say I more, women are consensus builders, that kind of thing. And this is all research-based. This is not just my opinion. All right, cultural diversity. Again, trying to just building awareness in all of these. It's really the secret is building awareness for gender and cultural differences. And then language gateways. The language is a little different. And the two things are obviously just different language in terms of, French, English, Spanish, German, Chinese, whatever it may be. So try to speak in the native language of the people with whom you are communicating. And then also avoiding jargon or techno talk. Every organization in every industry has their own language. So like when you take marketing, you learn the language of marketing. When you take organizational behavior, you learn the language of organizational behavior. There's a language in business law. There's a language in accounting, all this kind of thing. So try to avoid jargon if you can. Jargon also would include things like using letters to describe things. If any of you have ever worked in a restaurant, for example, like 86, people who work in restaurants know that if something's 86, it means it's off the menu. But someone who's never worked in a restaurant may or may not know that. So it's the actual language itself, and then also this idea of jargon, being aware of jargon and not using too much jargon to confuse people. Okay, civility and incivility. Civility is just basically treating people respectfully, and incivility is any kind of discourteous communication that somehow is disrespectful or rude, hurtful, injurious to someone. Okay, so there are some very negative consequences of incivility. Tends to be decline in satisfaction with supervisors. People don't want to be, everyone wants to be treated well, right? And if someone treats you badly, you don't necessarily want to, treat that person well. So there's, you become dissatisfied with your supervisors, or if that's who's providing the negativity, incivility, a coworker. There might be some perceptions of unfair treatment if someone, is nasty to you, but nice to other people, or nice to you and nasty to others. Sometimes you learn more about people by how they treat others than about how they treat you. And then civility, of course, there's many benefits. It avoids any kind of hurt feelings. It doesn't damage any kind of workplace relationships, and it also increases well-being in the workplace, which we know for a variety of reasons is very important, but not the least of which is when we talked about stress in the previous chapters. Okay, defensive communication. Defensive communication is anything that is aggressive or malevolent, means mean-spirited, or also passive and withdrawn. So people, maybe you are familiar with the term passive-aggressive, that people don't respond, and sometimes that's just as defensive as people who do respond, and maybe they act out in other ways. So that also can be very negative, and it causes all the injured feelings, communication breakdowns, alienation, retaliation, activity that's non-productive, or not organizational. We talked about organizational citizenship behavior earlier in the semester that falls into that, and then it makes it difficult to solve problems. And one thing I just want to say, because I've mentioned this a couple times, I feel like I've mentioned this a couple times in this chapter, is that I hope that you guys see that the concept is building on top of each other, one on top of another, after on top of another. I referred back to perception earlier. I referred back to emotional intelligence earlier. I just talked about organizational citizenship behavior and organizational deviance behavior. So these are all things we've talked about earlier in the semester, and it's important to understand that they layer on top of one on top of another. Okay, so that's defensive communication. All right, now non-defensive communication are things that can be, they're assertive and they're direct. It's and assertive isn't necessarily always a negative thing. It just means that it is what it is, and you're just stating the facts. And it should restore some level of order to the working relationship. So when we're talking about defensiveness, you can look at a subordinate defensive would just be, okay, you're right, I'm wrong. Whereas a supervisor might say, I'm right. That's just the way it is, I'm right. So you want to make sure that there's some sort of, that's not necessarily, neither one of those is necessarily good if conversation is required. Okay, so let's talk about some defensive tactics. Essentially, there's 4 of them that we talk about: the power play, labeling, misleading information, and hostile jokes, none of which are necessarily a good thing. So power play would be using your position to threaten someone. And actually in the next couple of chapters, after this section, we talk about power and politics, and power and influence, and power is something that should be managed very carefully by someone who does have it. Labeling, calling people names, is not necessarily very effective or nice about someone. Misleading information, or in this example, it could be subtitled gossip or unfounded information, that you're trying to unnecessarily malign that person or have other people have negative feelings about them. And then hostile jokes, calling someone names and just basically being mean. This is not productive. These are not good things to do. Okay, so non-defensive communication is very important. It's the idea that the person who is giving it has a lot of self-control and is very self-assured. It can enhance the relationship between the people. It makes the listener feel like they're being accepted, that rather than rejected. It should be honest. It should be informative. It should be realistic. It should be always controlled and assertive. You don't want to, back off too much with it, but you want to make sure that what you're saying is true and is informative. And this will lead to better workplace relationships. Okay, let's move on to nonverbal communication, which is an area that's of interest, I know, to a lot of people. So there are essentially 4 different types of nonverbal communication: proxemics, kinesics, facial and eye behavior, and paralanguage. So proxemics is the study of someone's perception and use of space. There's a really nice chart in the book that talks about that. If someone stands up really close to you, you could feel really uncomfortable, and it could also be very inappropriate. Not only you could feel uncomfortable, but it could make other people feel uncomfortable, and it's inappropriate. Usually, and then there's social distance and that kind of thing. So, and proxemics, how close you get to someone when you're talking to them, says a lot. It could refer to hostility, or it also could refer to great intimacy. Kinesics is body movement and posture, whether your shoulders are back or hunched forward, whether you're standing looking, with your head cocked, with your hands on your hip, that kind of thing. All right, facial and eye behavior. Just that, people who, you see people who roll their eyes or screw up their face, or it could be something very positive like a smile. So that gives clues to people. And then paralanguage is this idea of variations in speech, the pitch of your speech, the loudness, the tempo, the tone, the duration, laughing, crying, that kind of thing. That's the problem. In paralanguage, a lot of these things, the nonverbal communication is what we lose completely in any kind of electronic communication, and that's unfortunate. So you've seen some people who talk very, very rapidly and trying to get everything as quickly as possible. That could tell you something. Or, if they're talking very loudly, whatever it may be. Okay, almost finished here. So communicative disease is this idea that people who don't have any kind of close, heartfelt, intimate relationships with people, communication with people, it's the loneliness and social isolation that comes from that. So if you don't have anyone to talk to, or feel close with, or have this shared or common meaning, it can be very lonely. Again, going back to the stress chapter, we talked about ways to combat individual stress, and one of them is opening up and being able to talk to someone. So communicative disease is very important, and sadly, I think a lot of people suffer from that. All I can say is, if you think you know someone who might be lacking in that in their life, you probably would be doing them a great service by trying to be their friend for at least a little while. Anyway, it has all sorts of adverse effects on your heart and your cardiovascular system, the stress response. So it's important to engage in some kind of thoughtful, heartwarming conversation with your friends and your loved ones. I know that sounds trite, but it's true. And the people who mean something to you at work as well. Okay, information communication technology, ICT. It's this idea of, it's what we use so much of right now: email, databases, voicemail, smartphones, video conferencing. Those are all the things that are changing the way we communicate. So, how do you determine if it's considered ICT? It's instant exchange across geographic boundaries and time zones, that you can automatically talk to someone in California or Europe or Asia or whatever. You move out of this realm of office schedules, particularly if you're working with people who are on the other side of the globe, because they might be 12 hours ahead. They might be, in California it's 3 hours behind, or Europe is anywhere from 5 to 7 hours ahead. So anyway, you want to that's how you know if it's some sort of ICT, information communication technology. So you just need to be aware of that. That's something that you need to be aware of that. So it can have some not good results on behavior. It tends to be impersonal. Again, you lose the verbal cues. It does, in a way, equalize the participation, but it can and it can't. It encourages multitasking. I think if you've worked in an office, which I think many of you have, you can talk on the telephone, or you can talk on the telephone, or you can be emailing something and also doing something else at the same time. So you lose that 100% attention. And then it also, all these communication modes impact how we deal with each other face to face. And I think that, again, there's lots of research on all of this, the effects of technology on communication. A quick Google search would help you come up with some references to that. So anyway, okay, that's it on Chapter 8 with communication. And we'll see you back again for Chapter 9. Okay, thanks, guys.